5 years after divorcing my cheating wife, police showed up at my door. They claimed a child had been left in my car and that it was an emergency. I told them I didn't have child, yet they still arrested me. They were baffled. What happened next was completely unexpected. 5 years. That's how long it's been since I kicked my cheating ex-wife Angela to the curb. And honestly, those 5 years have been the most peaceful stretch of my adult life. No more lipstick on collars that wasn't mine, no more mysterious girls' nights that lasted until Tuesday, and definitely no more finding strange dudes' underwear in my hamper with names like Brad or Chad embroidered on the waistband. Yeah, Angela had a type, and apparently that type was any guy who wasn't her husband. So there I was on this particular Tuesday evening, living my best divorced guy life in my boxer shorts and a ratty old Nirvana t-shirt that had more holes than a government conspiracy theory. My kitchen had become my sanctuary, a place where I could reheat leftover General Tso's chicken without anyone judging me for eating it straight out of the container like some kind of civilized barbarian. The microwave was humming that familiar tune of bachelor cuisine when I heard it. Knock, 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 asterisk. Not just any knock, mind you. This was the kind of knock that could wake up every dead relative you've ever had, and probably a few you didn't know existed. It was the knock of authority, the knock of bad news, the knock that says your evening of leftover Chinese food and Netflix is about to take a hard left into crazy town. My dog Max, a 70-pound German Shepherd mix who I foolishly believed would protect me from intruders, took one look toward the front door and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He bolted faster than a tourist leaving Times Square, his nails clicking across my hardwood floors like castanets played by a caffeinated flamenco dancer. Real brave there, Max. I made a mental note to dock his kibble allowance. I paused the microwave, because nothing says responsible adult like not letting your dinner turn into a nuclear disaster, and padded barefoot to the front door. Through the peephole, I could see two figures standing on my porch, and they definitely weren't Girl Scouts pushing Thin Mints. Unless the Girl Scout organization had started recruiting middle-aged men with badges and attitudes. I opened the door and got my first good look at Tweedledee and Tweedledum in blue. Officer number 1 had a mustache that looked like it had been personally groomed by Tom Selleck's barber, and a face so stern I was pretty sure he hadn't cracked a smile since the Reagan administration was still worried about the Cold War. His partner looked like he'd just graduated from whatever police academy accepts students who still get carded at R-rated movies. The kid's uniform was so crisp and new, I half expected to see the price tags still dangling from his sleeve. Mr. Tyler Grant, Officer Mustache asked, his voice carrying all the warmth of a tax audit. Now, I've learned over the years that when cops show up at your door asking for you by name, it's never because you've won the lottery or because your long-lost rich uncle has left you a fortune. It's usually because someone, somewhere, has screwed up royally, and apparently, that someone was supposed to be me. That depends, I said, leaning against my doorframe with what I hoped looked like casual confidence, but probably came across as the desperate bravado of a man whose evening plans had just been derailed by law enforcement. Are you guys selling cookies, or are you here to deliver bad news? Because if it's cookies, I should warn you. I'm lactose intolerant and I don't have cash. Officer Rookie shifted uncomfortably, like he wasn't sure if I was being funny or if this was some kind of test they hadn't covered in the academy. Officer Mustache, however, was clearly not in the mood for my sparkling wit. Sir, we need to talk to you about a child that was found unconscious in your vehicle earlier today. I blinked. Then I blinked again, just to make sure I'd heard correctly. I'm sorry, what now? A child, sir. Found in your car. In your driveway. I looked past them to my driveway, where my slightly dented but reliable Honda Civic sat exactly where I'd left it that morning when I'd gotten back from the grocery store. The same car that had been empty except for a half-eaten bag of Cheez-Its and my collection of fast food napkins that I kept meaning to throw away, but never did. And then I laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle, but a full-blown, belly-shaking laugh that probably made me look completely unhinged. Because really, what else was I supposed to do? The situation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that laughter seemed like the only sane response. Officers, I said, wiping a tear from my eye, I hate to break it to you, but I don't even have a kid. Unless someone's been running some kind of underground cloning operation and decided to make a copy of me out of pity, which, let's be honest, would be a pretty cruel thing to do to an innocent child. Neither of them laughed. In fact, Officer Mustache's expression somehow managed to get even more serious, which I hadn't thought was physically possible. Officer Rookie just stared at me like I'd started speaking in tongues. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning." That's when everything went from surreal to straight-up nightmare territory. Before I could process what was happening, before I could ask for a lawyer or demand to see a warrant or do any of those things you see people do in movies, Officer Mustache had produced a pair of handcuffs that looked like they'd seen more action than a Hollywood stuntman. "Wait, hold on." I started to protest, but apparently my constitutional rights had left the building along with Max's courage. The cold metal clicked around my wrists with a finality that made my stomach drop into my shoes. And that's when I noticed her, Mrs. Klein from across the street, standing at her living room window like she was watching the season finale of her favorite soap opera. She had her coffee mug clutched in both hands, and her eyes were wide with the kind of gleeful shock that you usually only see at monster truck rallies or when someone's about to get voted off reality TV. I could practically see her mental wheels turning, already composing the neighborhood gossip email that would be in everyone's inbox before I even made it to the police station. "This is a mistake," I called out as Officer Rookie guided me toward their squad car with a hand on my shoulder that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a gentle escort to the apocalypse. A huge, massive, cosmic-level mistake. But Mrs. Klein just took another sip of her coffee and settled in for the show. "Welcome to my life, folks. Population, me, and apparently one very confused police department." The police station smelled like disinfectant, stale coffee, and broken dreams. Basically the same aroma as my local DMV, but with more handcuffs and fewer people complaining about their license photos. They'd uncuffed me once we got inside, which was nice of them, though I'm pretty sure it was more about procedural requirements than any sudden burst of human decency. I found myself sitting in what I can only describe as the world's most uncomfortable chair in an interrogation room that looked like it had been decorated by someone whose only design inspiration came from Soviet-era architecture and clinical depression. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the persistence of a mosquito in a camping tent, casting that special kind of harsh lighting that makes everyone look like they're auditioning for a zombie movie. Officer Mustache, whose real name, I'd learned, was Detective Morrison, sat across from me with a manila folder that he treated like it contained the nuclear launch codes. His partner, Detective Chun, not Officer Rookie, apparently, though he still looked like he should be asking if I wanted fries with that, stood near the door like he was expecting me to make a break for it at any moment. "Mr. Grant," Morrison began, opening his folder with all the dramatic flair of someone revealing a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. "We found some interesting items in your vehicle." I leaned back in my chair, which squeaked in protest like it was personally offended by my weight. "Yeah? What kind of interesting? Are we talking about my collection of fast food napkins? Or did someone finally discover that the Cheez-Its in my car are technically a renewable resource?" Morrison's mustache twitched, whether from annoyance or amusement, I couldn't tell. The man had perfected the art of the poker face to a degree that would make professional gamblers weep with envy. "We found diapers, Mr. Grant. Size 4 Huggies. Still in the package." I blinked. "Okay, that's weird, but maybe someone." "We also found a car seat. Pink and purple, properly installed in the back seat." My stomach started doing gymnastics routines that would have impressed the Olympic judges. This was getting seriously weird, like finding out your neighbor is actually 3 raccoons in a trench coat weird. "And there's more," Chin chimed in, apparently having found his voice. He looked like he'd been practicing this moment in front of his bathroom mirror. "We found a blanket, hand-knitted, with a name embroidered on it." Morrison slid a plastic evidence bag across the table like he was dealing cards in the world's most twisted game of blackjack. Inside was a small, obviously expensive baby blanket in soft pastels, and stitched across one corner in delicate pink thread was a name that hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo of pure, concentrated dread. Leia, asterisk. My brain did that thing where it completely shuts down for a moment. Like when your computer encounters an error so catastrophic that it just gives up and shows you the blue screen of death. Because that name, that very specific, very unusual name, wasn't just any random collection of letters. That name belonged to a conversation I'd had exactly 6 years ago with my then-wife Angela, back when we were still pretending our marriage wasn't circling the drain like a dying goldfish. We'd been lying in bed one lazy Sunday morning, still in that honeymoon phase where we actually enjoyed each other's company, and she'd started talking about baby names. Not because she was pregnant, God knows we'd tried enough times without success, but just because that's what couples do when they're delusional enough to think their future involves matching rocking chairs and joint checking accounts. If we ever have a daughter, she'd said, tracing patterns on my chest with her finger, I want to name her Leah. It means night in Hebrew. Beautiful, right? I'd agreed because, at the time, I was still under the mistaken impression that my wife's opinions mattered to me and that we'd actually be having children together instead of having lawyers divide up our stuff like it was some kind of twisted game show. Mr. Grant, Morrison's voice cut through my mental time travel. You recognize the name? I looked up at him, and I could feel my face doing that thing where it betrays every emotion I'm trying to hide. I've never been good at poker, which is probably why Angela cleaned me out so thoroughly in the divorce. Yeah, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. I recognize it. It's what my ex-wife used to say she'd name our daughter, if we ever had one, which we didn't. Unless she's been taking some very creative liberties with the truth, which, knowing Angela, is entirely possible. The two detectives exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their professional opinion of my situation. It was the kind of look that said, this guy is either the world's worst liar or the universe's favorite punching bag. Your ex-wife, Chen said, consulting his own notepad like he was reading from a script. That would be Angela Morrison? Angela Freeman, I corrected. She took back her maiden name after the divorce. Can't say I blamed her. If I'd been married to me, I probably would have changed my name too. Maybe to something completely different, like Rodriguez or Smith, or please don't associate me with that guy. Morrison made a note in his folder. And when did you last see Mrs. Freeman? I had to think about that one. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, but we'd had our final, spectacular blowout argument about 2 years before that. Angela had a flair for dramatic exits that would have made Broadway directors weep with envy. About 5 years ago, I said, right around the time she decided that being married to me was less appealing than being married to her personal trainer, or her yoga instructor, or possibly both of them at the same time. Angela was always an overachiever. And you haven't had any contact with her since then? Detective, I said, leaning forward in my squeaky chair. When Angela left, she didn't just burn bridges. She nuked them from orbit and then salted the earth for good measure. The woman blocked me on social media platforms I didn't even know existed. If she wanted to talk to me, she'd probably have to send smoke signals or hire a medium. That's when Morrison dropped the real bombshell. The one that made everything else seem like a gentle summer breeze compared to a Category 5 hurricane. Mr. Grant, we have reason to believe that the child found in your car, a 4-year-old girl, is your daughter. I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that indicates amusement, but the kind of laugh that escapes from your throat when your brain has completely given up trying to process reality. It was the laugh of a man whose day had started with leftover Chinese food and was apparently going to end with him being accused of child abandonment. Gentlemen, I said, spreading my hands wide like I was presenting evidence to a jury. I appreciate the creativity of this theory, I really do. But there's one tiny, insignificant little problem with your hypothesis. I don't even endanger my houseplants. They die naturally, through my complete lack of gardening skills and my inability to remember that living things need water. The idea that I would endanger a child, any child, much less one that supposedly belongs to me, is so far-fetched that it makes alien abduction stories seem reasonable. But even as I said it, even as I maintained my innocence with all the righteous indignation I could muster, that name kept echoing in my head like a song you can't get out of your brain. Leah, asterisk. And somewhere, in the deepest, most paranoid corner of my mind, a little voice started whispering that maybe, just maybe, Angela hadn't been quite as done with me as I'd thought. It took Carla Rodriguez exactly 4 hours to get me out of what I'd started thinking of as the concrete hotel of broken dreams. And let me tell you, those were 4 of the longest hours of my adult life. I'd spent them in a holding cell that smelled like industrial-strength disinfectant mixed with the collective regrets of everyone who'd ever made a poor life choice. sitting on a bench that had all the comfort of a medieval torture device. My cellmate for the evening was a guy named Ricky who'd been arrested for trying to steal a city bus because, and I quote, "The schedule was all messed up and someone needed to fix the transportation crisis in this town." I have to admit, his logic was flawed, but his civic engagement was admirable. Carla Rodriguez turned out to be exactly the kind of public defender you'd get if you ordered a lawyer from Amazon and selected no nonsense, caffeinated, and possibly bulletproof from the available options. She was maybe 5'4" in heels, but she walked into that police station like she owned the place and everyone in it was just renting space from her. Her handshake could have crushed walnuts, and her briefcase looked like it had survived more legal battles than the Constitution. "Tyler Grant," she'd said when we first met in the station's conference room, which was basically the interrogation room's slightly less depressing cousin. "I'm Carla Rodriguez, your court-appointed attorney. I've reviewed your case, and I have to say, you've managed to step in some grade A premium bullshit here." I liked her immediately. She didn't coddle me, didn't pat my hand and tell me everything was going to be okay, and definitely didn't pretend that this was all just a big misunderstanding that would blow over like a bad weather front. Instead, she laid it out for me with all the gentle compassion of a sledgehammer to the kneecaps. "You're looking at felony child endangerment," she'd said, consulting a tablet that looked like it had been through more wars than a combat veteran. "If convicted, you could be facing anywhere from 2 to 10 years in state prison, depending on how vindictive the prosecutor's feeling and whether or not they've had their morning coffee." I groaned and put my head in my hands, which made my hair stick up at weird angles and probably didn't help my already questionable credibility. "Lady, I don't even endanger my plants. They die naturally, through my complete lack of botanical knowledge and my inability to remember that photosynthesis requires actual sunlight." "Yeah, well," she'd replied, not looking up from her tablet. "Tell it to the judge. And maybe work on your plant metaphors. They're not exactly screaming responsible adult here." But somehow, through a combination of legal wizardry, bureaucratic arm wrestling, and what I suspected was pure stubbornness, she'd managed to get me released on bail. $25,000, which was about $24,000 more than I had in my checking account. But thankfully my Uncle Pete had always said that family was there to help you out of jams, even if those jams involved potential felony charges and mysterious children. The moment I stepped out of the police station, though, I realized that my legal troubles were just the appetizer in what was turning out to be a 7-course meal of absolute chaos. Reporters everywhere, like someone had kicked over an anthill, except instead of ants, it was people with cameras and microphones and the kind of aggressive curiosity that makes paparazzi look like shy librarians. They swarmed toward me like I was some kind of celebrity, except instead of wanting autographs, they wanted sound bites that would probably be edited to make me look like the poster child for deadbeat fathers everywhere. "Mr. Grant, Mr. Grant," one of them shouted, shoving a microphone in my face that looked like it could double as a small weapon. She was a blonde woman in a red suit that screamed, "I take my journalism very seriously, and I'm not afraid to trample small children to get a story. Do you have anything to say to the community as a father who abandoned his child?" I stopped walking. Because really, what else was I supposed to do? Ignore them? That never works. They just follow you like particularly aggressive seagulls. Run? I wasn't in nearly good enough shape for that, and besides, running would just make me look guilty. So instead, I looked directly into her camera and gave them the most honest answer I could muster under the circumstances. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the fact that my life had apparently become a reality TV show without my consent. "Tell my mom she's finally a grandma. Surprise. Also, tell her I might be late for Sunday dinner next week because I'm apparently living in some kind of parallel universe where I have children I didn't know about, and the legal system has decided I'm public enemy number 1. The reporter blinked, clearly not expecting that particular response. Behind her, camera operators adjusted their equipment like they were trying to figure out whether what I'd just said was usable footage or just the ramblings of a man whose grip on reality had become somewhat negotiable. I pushed through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea except less biblical and more chaotic, and somehow made it to Carla's car without getting trampled or accidentally quoted saying something that would end up as tomorrow's headline. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of Carla's phone buzzing every 30 seconds with what I assumed were either more legal developments or people wanting to know if she was representing that guy from the news. I stared out the window and watched my neighborhood roll by, looking exactly the same as it had that morning when I'd been just another divorced guy reheating Chinese food instead of a suspected child abandoner with a legal team. When we pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind of silence that happens when something important is missing. It took me a moment to figure out what it was. No barking. Max, my 70-pound German Shepherd mix and self-appointed home security system, wasn't rushing to greet me like he usually did. I found him hiding under my dining room table, looking at me with the kind of expression that clearly said, "Way to ruin our lives, bro." I was just starting to get comfortable with our routine of naps, walks, and pretending to be tough whenever the mailman shows up. "Thanks for the moral support, buddy," I told him as he slunk deeper under the table. Really feeling the unconditional love here. That's when I decided to do what any rational person would do in my situation. Investigate. Because if someone was trying to frame me for child abandonment, they had to have gotten their information from somewhere. And the most logical place to start was with the one person who knew exactly what name I'd want to give a daughter and had both the motivation and the creative vindictiveness to use it against me. I fired up my laptop and navigated to Instagram, which felt like digital self-harm but seemed necessary under the circumstances. It didn't take long to find Angela's business account. She'd never been subtle about self-promotion, and apparently success in real estate required constant social media validation. And there it was, posted just 3 days ago. A photo that made my blood run colder than a January morning in Minnesota. Angela, looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine spread about successful businesswomen who definitely don't need men to complete them, standing in what looked like an upscale office. She was wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her smile bright enough to power a small city. And in her arms, she was holding a toddler. A little girl with dark curls and big eyes that looked familiar in a way that made my stomach drop into my shoes. The caption read, "Leia's first showing. My little boss baby learning the family business. Hashtag real estate life, hashtag mom boss, hashtag future entrepreneur." I zoomed in on the photo, which made the image pixelated but didn't make it any less devastating. Those eyes. Those were definitely my eyes looking back at me from a face that was too young and too innocent to be mixed up in whatever game Angela was playing. But the timestamp on the photo told a story that didn't make sense. If this was really my daughter, if Angela had been raising her for the past 4 years, why was I just finding out about it now? And more importantly, why was she showing up unconscious in my car instead of living her apparently very successful life as Angela's little boss baby? I'd been staring at that Instagram photo for about 20 minutes, zooming in and out like some kind of digital detective trying to solve the mystery of my apparently secret offspring, when the doorbell rang. Not the aggressive, wake-the-dead knocking of law enforcement this time, but the kind of casual, confident ring that suggests the person on the other side of the door has every right to be there and probably expects you to be happy to see them. Max, still traumatized from our earlier adventure in law enforcement, didn't even lift his head from under the dining room table. Some guard dog. At this point, a burglar could walk in wearing tap shoes and juggling chainsaws, and Max would probably just roll over and ask for belly rubs. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach do that thing where it tries to climb up through your throat and escape through your mouth. Because standing on my front porch, looking like she'd just stepped off the cover of Successful Women Who Definitely Don't Need Their Ex-Husbands magazine, was Angela Freeman herself. She looked exactly the same as she had in that Instagram photo, except now she was live and in person and apparently making house calls. Her blonde hair was still perfectly styled in that way that probably required a team of professionals and a small mortgage, and she was wearing a black designer dress that probably cost more than most people's car payments. She had her phone in one hand and what looked like an expensive leather purse in the other, and she was checking her manicure like she was waiting for a taxi instead of standing on the doorstep of the man she'd divorced 5 years ago. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. Maybe if I just didn't answer the door, she'd go away and take whatever fresh hell she was bringing with her. But then I remembered that my car was in the driveway, my lights were on, and Angela had always been persistent to the point of being legally annoying. I opened the door and immediately regretted every life choice that had led me to this moment. "Hello, Tyler," she said. and her voice was exactly the same as it had been during our marriage, smooth, confident, and carrying just a hint of condescension that suggested she was talking to someone slightly less intelligent than she was. Which, to be fair, had always been her opinion of pretty much everyone. Angela, I replied, because my mother had raised me to be polite even in the face of apocalyptic personal disasters. This is unexpected, and by unexpected, I mean horrifying. What the hell are you doing here? She smiled that same Hollywood-perfect smile that had initially attracted me to her back when I was young and stupid and thought that marrying someone based on their ability to look good in photographs was a solid life strategy. Then, without waiting for an invitation, because Angela had never been big on things like social conventions or basic human decency, she walked right past me into my living room. "Is that any way to greet the mother of your child?" she said, tossing her purse onto my couch like she still paid half the mortgage and had every right to treat my furniture like her personal storage unit. I closed the door and turned to face her, feeling like I was about to engage in combat with someone who'd had 5 years to plan her strategy while I'd had about 30 seconds to figure out what the hell was happening. "Mother of my..." I started, then stopped because my brain was doing that thing where it short-circuits when confronted with information that doesn't compute. "Angela, the only thing we ever raised together was my blood pressure and your credit card debt. Unless you've been running some kind of secret child manufacturing operation for the past 4 years, I'm pretty sure you're not the mother of my anything." She walked around my living room like she was conducting an inspection, touching things and moving them slightly, which was exactly the kind of passive-aggressive territory marking that had driven me crazy during our marriage. She picked up a picture of me and Max from last Christmas. We'd both been wearing Santa hats because I'd thought it was funny, and Max had tolerated it because he was a good sport and studied it like she was analyzing evidence. "You've redecorated," she said, which was Angela speak for, "Your taste is still terrible, but I'm going to pretend to be diplomatically neutral about it." "Yeah, well," I replied. "Turns out when you're not spending money on someone else's yoga classes and organic juice cleanses, you can actually afford things like furniture that isn't held together with duct tape and hope." She set the picture down and turned to face me, and that's when I saw it. That look in her eyes that I remembered from our marriage. It was the look she got right before she was about to do something that would make my life significantly more complicated. During our marriage, that look had usually preceded expensive purchases or spontaneous trips to visit her sister in California. Now, I had a feeling it meant something much worse. "Leia is your daughter, Tyler," she said, and her voice had taken on that matter-of-fact tone she used when she was stating something she considered to be obviously true, like "the sky is blue," or "your cooking is terrible." I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming, and I was pretty sure the neighbors had already gotten enough entertainment for one day. "Angela," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the fact that my entire worldview was apparently being rewritten in real time. "I think I would have remembered if we'd had a child together. It's not exactly the kind of thing that slips your mind, like forgetting to buy milk or missing a dentist appointment." She smiled again, but this time it wasn't the Hollywood smile. This was the smile she used to give me right before she dropped bombshells that would crater my entire existence. It was the smile she'd worn when she told me she was finding herself with her personal trainer. It was the smile that meant you're about to discover that your life is much more complicated than you thought. "She's not biologically yours," she said, like she was discussing the weather or commenting on the traffic. "But she's legally yours. Has been for 4 years." I sat down heavily on my couch, partly because my legs suddenly felt like they were made of overcooked spaghetti, and partly because I needed to be sitting down for whatever was coming next. "What the hell does that mean, Angela?" She walked over to my window and looked out at the street, where Mrs. Klein was probably still camped out with her coffee mug, hoping for more drama to unfold for her entertainment. "It means," she said, still looking out the window, "that when Leia was born, I put your name on the birth certificate. Legally, officially, you've been her father since day one. Congratulations, Tyler. You're a dad." The room started spinning slightly, like I was on a carnival ride that had been designed by someone with a sadistic sense of humor and a degree in psychological torture. "You put my name on the birth certificate," I repeated slowly, trying to process this information through a brain that was currently running on pure adrenaline and leftover Chinese food. "Without telling me. Without asking me." without even mentioning that you were pregnant. I had my reasons, she said, turning back to face me with that same infuriating calm that suggested she'd planned this entire conversation down to the last detail. Your reasons, I said, standing up because sitting down was making me feel like I was trapped, and Angela had always been the kind of person who required you to be ready to run at a moment's notice. Angela, you can't just decide someone's a father without consulting them. That's not how parenthood works. That's not how anything works. She shrugged, like we were discussing something as mundane as pizza toppings instead of the complete restructuring of my entire existence. Well, she said, checking her phone like she had somewhere more important to be. You have 48 hours to accept it and step up, or I'm calling Child Protective Services and telling them that you've been an absent father who's never provided support for his daughter. And with that, she picked up her purse, walked to my front door, and turned back to give me one last smile, the kind of smile that belonged in a horror movie right before the killer reveals their master plan. Nice seeing you again, Tyler. You always did look good when you were confused. Then she was gone, leaving me standing in my living room, staring at the closed door, wondering if it was possible for a person's entire life to implode twice in the same decade. Because apparently it was. After Angela's surprise visit and her casual announcement that I was apparently a father whether I liked it or not, I spent the rest of the evening pacing around my house like a caged animal, occasionally stopping to stare at Max, who was still hiding under the dining room table like he expected the FBI to come back for round two. You know what, buddy? I told him, crouching down to meet his judgmental eyes. At least one of us has the right idea. Maybe I should crawl under there with you, and we can just wait for this whole thing to blow over. Max just gave me a look that clearly said, I tried to warn you by running away earlier, but did you listen? No. Now look where we are. But by morning, after a night of exactly 0 sleep and approximately 17 cups of coffee, I'd come to a decision. If Angela was playing some kind of long con, and knowing Angela, she absolutely was, then I needed to figure out what her angle was. And the best way to do that was to start with the obvious question. If I wasn't actually Leia's biological father, then who was? Which brought me to my current situation, standing outside Pump It Up Fitness at 7:30 in the morning, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as various people who clearly had their lives together worked out their problems on expensive exercise equipment while I stood outside working out my existential crisis. I'd done some detective work the night before, which mostly involved scrolling through Angela's social media accounts like some kind of digital stalker and cross-referencing dates and locations. It had taken me about 3 hours and way too much coffee, but I'd finally found what I was looking for. A pattern of check-ins at this particular gym that corresponded almost exactly with the timeline of Leia's conception. Greg Whitman was easy to spot, partly because Angela had tagged him in approximately 47 photos of workout buddies and fitness motivation, and partly because he looked exactly like the kind of guy Angela would cheat on me with. He was tall, blonde, and had the kind of sculpted physique that suggested he spent more time looking at himself in mirrors than most people spend looking at their phones. His arms were bigger than my head, and he had that particular brand of gym confidence that comes from knowing you can bench press more than most people weigh. He was currently doing bicep curls with weights that probably weighed more than Max, and he was making the kind of focused facial expressions that suggested this was very serious business that required his complete concentration and possibly some light grunting. I waited until he finished his set, then approached him with all the casual confidence of a man who definitely belonged in a place where people voluntarily lifted heavy objects for fun. Greg Whitman, I said, trying to sound like I wasn't completely out of my element in a place that smelled like disinfectant and the collective determination of people who actually followed through on their New Year's resolutions. He looked up at me, and I could see him doing the mental math of trying to figure out who I was and whether I posed any kind of threat to his morning workout routine. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he was running my face through some kind of internal database of people he should know. Yeah, that's me, he said, setting down his weights with the kind of care that suggested they were precious family heirlooms rather than just chunks of metal. Do I know you? Tyler Grant, I said, extending my hand in what I hoped looked like a friendly gesture rather than the desperate move of a man whose life had become a daytime soap opera. I think we have a mutual acquaintance. Angela Freeman. The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. His face went from mildly curious gym bro to someone who'd just been told they had to pay taxes on their protein powder. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tensed, and I could practically see him cycling through what were probably some very colorful thoughts about my ex-wife. "Oh," he said, and there was a world of meaning packed into that single syllable. "You're the ex-husband." "Guilty as charged," I replied. "Though apparently that's not the only thing I'm guilty of these days. Mind if we talk? Somewhere that doesn't involve you lifting things that could crush me if you accidentally drop them." Greg looked around the gym like he was considering whether to have this conversation in public or whether it was the kind of discussion that required privacy and possibly some kind of legal disclaimer. After a moment, he nodded toward the juice bar in the corner, which was apparently where serious fitness people went to have serious conversations over beverages that cost more than most people's lunch. We settled into a corner booth that gave us a clear view of the gym floor, while providing enough privacy that the other patrons couldn't hear what was probably going to be a very awkward conversation about my ex-wife's reproductive choices. "So," Greg said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual body language that suggested he was trying very hard to look relaxed, "I'm guessing this isn't a social call." "Not exactly," I replied. "I'm going to cut right to the chase here, Greg, because frankly, my life has become weird enough that I don't have time for small talk. Did you and Angela have an affair while she was married to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his protein shake like it contained the secrets of the universe. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from defensive to something that looked almost like sympathy. "Yeah," he said simply. "We did. For about 8 months, toward the end of your marriage. I'm not proud of it, man. I didn't even know she was married until we were already involved. I felt something that might have been relief if it weren't mixed with about 17 other emotions that I couldn't properly identify. At least I wasn't going crazy. At least there had been someone else." "And did she ever mention being pregnant?" I asked, leaning forward slightly because this was the important question, the one that might actually explain why I was currently facing felony charges for abandoning a child I'd never met. Greg's face went through another series of expressions, each one more complicated than the last. He ran his hand through his hair, which remained perfectly styled despite the gesture, and let out a long breath. "She told me she was pregnant," he said finally. "About 6 months after we started seeing each other. Said it was mine. I was terrified, to be honest. I was 26, working as a personal trainer, living in a studio apartment that was smaller than most people's closets. I wasn't ready to be anybody's father. What happened? She said she lost the baby. Miscarriage. I felt terrible about it, obviously, but also." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Also relieved," I suggested. "Also relieved," he admitted. "Which makes me a terrible person, but yeah, I wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. But then, a few months later, I found out she'd been seeing other guys. Plural. Apparently, I wasn't the only one she was cheating with. This was getting better and better. Not only was my ex-wife a serial cheater, but she was apparently running some kind of romantic Ponzi scheme where multiple guys thought they were her one and only side piece. How many others? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. That I knew about? At least 3. There was me, there was some guy named Marcus who worked in finance, and there was her yoga instructor, Zen or Zane or something like that. Probably others I never found out about. Angela was always ambitious. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. So Angela had been pregnant, but Greg thought she'd miscarried, which meant either she'd lied to him about losing the baby, or there was another explanation entirely. "Greg," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think there's any chance that Leia, the little girl, could be yours?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him doing the math in his head, counting months, and trying to figure out timelines that probably made about as much sense as a Sudoku puzzle designed by someone having a psychotic break. "I don't know," he said finally. "The timing could work. But Tyler, if she is mine, I never knew about it. Angela told me she lost the baby, and then she disappeared from my life completely. Changed gyms, blocked my number, the whole thing. I figured she was embarrassed about the cheating thing and wanted to move on. Would you be willing to take a paternity test?" I asked, feeling like I was conducting some kind of bizarre job interview for the position of actual father of mysterious child. "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "If there's a chance that little girl is mine, I want to know." I'm in a completely different place in my life now than I was 6 years ago. I'm married. I own my own gym. I'm ready to be responsible for someone other than myself. And that's how I found myself, 3 hours later, sitting in the waiting room of Quick DNA Labs with Greg Whitman. Both of us staring at magazines we weren't reading while we waited for our turn to get swabbed for what was possibly the most important multiple-choice test either of us would ever take. The lab technician was a cheerful woman named Beth who acted like paternity disputes were as routine as oil changes, which I suppose, in her line of work, they probably were. She swabbed the inside of Greg's cheek first, then mine, sealing each sample in its own little plastic tube with all the ceremony of someone packaging leftovers. Results will be ready in 3 business days, she told us, like she was telling us when our pizza would be delivered. You'll get an email with a secure link to access your results online. 3 days. 72 hours to find out whether I was actually responsible for a child I'd never met, or whether this was all just another elaborate chapter in the ongoing saga of Angela Freeman's creative approach to human relationships. As Greg and I walked out of the lab together, he clapped me on the shoulder with a hand that could probably bench press a small car. "Whatever happens, man," he said, "at least we'll know the truth." I nodded, but privately I was thinking that when it came to Angela, the truth was usually just the starting point for an even more complicated lie. That night, I discovered someone had spray-painted "Deadbeat Dad" across my garage door in bright red letters that were visible from approximately 3 zip codes away. The artwork was clearly the handiwork of someone with strong opinions about my parenting skills and a very loose understanding of due process. I stood in my driveway, staring at my newly decorated garage while Max sniffed around the base of the door like he was conducting his own forensic investigation. "Well, Max," I said, "at least they used good penmanship. If you're going to vandalize someone's property, you might as well make sure it's legible." Max looked up at me with an expression that clearly said, "This is what we get for trusting humans." And honestly, I was starting to think he had a point. The envelope showed up on my doorstep the next morning, wedged between my door and the frame, like some kind of sinister love letter from someone with a very twisted sense of romance. It was one of those manila envelopes that immediately scream, "Your life is about to get more complicated." The kind that never contains anything good like lottery winnings or an invitation to someone's barbecue. I'd been up since about 5 a.m., drinking coffee and staring at my garage door, trying to figure out the most cost-effective way to remove spray paint that had apparently been applied with the permanence of a presidential monument. Max had given up on moral support and was currently sprawled across my kitchen floor like a furry throw rug, occasionally opening one eye to check if I was still having my existential crisis or if we could maybe move on to more important things like breakfast. The envelope had my name written on it in block letters that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd watched too many crime dramas and thought anonymity required the handwriting skills of a kindergartner with commitment issues. No return address, no postmark, just Tyler Grant in letters that screamed, "This is definitely not good news." I picked it up and immediately noticed it was heavier than expected, like it was stuffed with something more substantial than your typical threatening letter or pizza coupon. I carried it inside, setting it on my kitchen counter while I poured another cup of coffee, because whatever was in that envelope was definitely going to require caffeine. Max lifted his head from the floor and gave me a look that clearly said, "Are you really going to open the scary envelope, or are we going to pretend it doesn't exist until it goes away?" "Sorry, buddy," I told him. "Ignoring problems only works if you're a politician or someone with really good health insurance." I opened the envelope and immediately understood why it had felt so heavy. It was stuffed with photographs. Not just a few photographs, but what looked like an entire surveillance portfolio of my life over the past week, documented with the thoroughness of someone conducting a federal investigation or planning to blackmail a celebrity. The first photo showed me leaving the police station after my arrest, looking exactly as confused and disheveled as I'd felt. Someone had managed to capture the precise moment when I'd realized my life had become a public spectacle, and let me tell you, it wasn't my most photogenic moment. I looked like someone who'd been hit by a truck carrying bad news and then run over by the follow-up truck carrying even worse news. The second photo showed me arguing with Angela on my front porch, our body language clearly indicating that this wasn't a friendly reunion between former spouses who'd managed to maintain a mature, adult relationship. Angela looked poised and in control, while I looked like someone who was trying to figure out if reality had shifted into an alternate dimension when I wasn't paying attention. The third photo showed me walking into quick DNA labs with Greg, both of us looking like we were heading to our own execution rather than a simple medical procedure. Whoever had taken this picture had managed to capture the exact moment when Greg was patting my shoulder, which in context probably looked like some kind of weird male bonding ritual or the beginning of a very strange bromance. But it was the fourth photo that really got my attention. It showed me standing in my kitchen the night before, visible through my window, holding what was clearly the spray paint can I'd used to try to touch up the deadbeat dad graffiti on my garage. The angle was perfect, the lighting was clear, and the timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken at exactly 11:47 p.m. Someone had been watching me. Not just watching me, but documenting my every move with the dedication of a nature photographer following a particularly interesting species of dysfunctional human through its natural habitat. I flipped through the rest of the photos, each one more unsettling than the last. Me getting my mail. Me walking Max. Me standing in my living room in my underwear, which was definitely not something I consented to being photographed doing, and frankly violated several principles of human decency and probably a few laws about privacy. At the bottom of the stack, underneath all the photographic evidence of my recent transformation into a public figure, I found something that made my blood pressure spike into what my doctor would probably describe as medically inadvisable territory. A birth certificate. Official looking, complete with state seals and signatures, and all the bureaucratic authority that makes government documents so terrifying. According to this particular piece of paper, Leah Marie Freeman had been born 4 years ago at General Hospital, and listed as her father was one Tyler James Grant. My name, my social security number, my signature, which looked exactly like my actual signature except for the small detail that I'd never signed this document in my life. I stared at the birth certificate, trying to process what I was looking at. The paper felt real, the signatures looked authentic, and the official seals appeared to be legitimate. But I knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from being present for your own life, that I had never signed this document, which meant someone had either forged my signature with professional-level skill, or there was some kind of bureaucratic mix-up that had somehow resulted in me being legally responsible for a child I'd never met. And given everything I knew about Angela's creative relationship with the truth, I was leaning heavily toward the forgery option. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation of what was either the most elaborate prank in history or evidence that my ex-wife had missed her calling as a professional con artist. Tyler. Angela's voice came through the speaker with that same honey-sweet tone she'd used during our marriage when she was about to ask for something that would cost me money or sanity. Did you get my little care package? Your little. I stopped, because suddenly everything made perfect sense in the way that only makes sense when you're dealing with someone whose moral compass points exclusively toward whatever benefits them most. Angela, did you have me followed? Followed is such an ugly word, she said, and I could practically hear her examining her manicure through the phone. I prefer documented. You've been living such an interesting life lately. I thought someone should keep track of it for posterity. You had someone take pictures of me in my underwear, I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the fact that I was currently experiencing what my therapist would probably describe as justifiable homicidal ideation. That wasn't intentional, she replied with the casual dismissiveness of someone discussing a minor inconvenience like a late pizza delivery. But it's certainly comprehensive documentation of your current lifestyle choices. What do you want, Angela? What I've always wanted, Tyler. Control. You see, Leia isn't just some random child who happened to end up in your car. She's the bait. You're the prize. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, because this conversation was clearly going to require me to be sitting down for the inevitable revelation that would make everything else seem like a minor inconvenience. Prize for what? For proving that I can still pull your strings whenever I want to. For demonstrating that 5 years later, you're still the same predictable, controllable man I married. For showing everyone in this pathetic little town that Tyler Grant is exactly the kind of person who abandons children and can't be trusted with responsibility. But the paternity test will show exactly what I wanted to show, she interrupted. Do you really think I haven't thought of everything, Tyler? I've had 4 years to plan this. 4 years to set up every detail, every contingency, every possible outcome. You're not playing chess with me anymore, sweetheart. You're playing checkers, and I've already won. So what's the endgame here, Angela? What do you actually get out of destroying my life? She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost that sweet, condescending tone and taken on something that sounded almost honest. Almost. I get to prove that I'm better than you. I get to show everyone that I made the right choice when I left. I get to demonstrate that Tyler Grant is a failure as a husband, as a man, and now as a father. And most importantly, I get to sleep better at night knowing that you're finally paying for the 5 years of my life that you wasted. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my kitchen, staring at a stack of photographs that documented my recent descent into whatever circle of hell was reserved for divorced guys who accidentally became the stars of elaborate revenge plots. Max patted over and rested his head on my knee, giving me a look that clearly said, "I tried to warn you about that woman, but did you listen? No. Now look where we are." "You know what, Max?" I said, scratching behind his ears. "If I'm the prize, then Angela's got really low standards for what constitutes winning." But even as I said it, I was already trying to figure out how to play a game where someone else had written all the rules, dealt all the cards, and apparently had been cheating since before I even knew we were playing. Because if there's one thing I'd learned about Angela during our marriage, it was that she never did anything without having at least 3 backup plans and a way to make sure she came out looking like the victim. And this time, it looked like she'd outdone herself. 3 days, 72 hours. For 1,320 minutes of wondering whether I was about to become the father of a 4-year-old girl I'd never met, or whether this was all just another elaborate performance in the ongoing theater of Angela's revenge fantasies. I'd spent those 3 days drinking too much coffee, sleeping too little, and having increasingly philosophical conversations with Max about the nature of responsibility and whether it was possible for someone to retroactively become a parent through sheer bureaucratic manipulation. Max, for his part, had maintained his position that humans were fundamentally unreliable and that the whole situation could have been avoided if I'd just learned to hide under furniture at the first sign of trouble like any sensible creature would do. The email arrived at exactly 9:23 a.m. on Thursday morning, while I was standing in my kitchen trying to decide whether my 4th cup of coffee was going to help me think more clearly or just make my hands shake enough that I wouldn't be able to operate my phone properly. The subject line was refreshingly straightforward. DNA test results. Case number 4847521. I clicked on the secure link with all the enthusiasm of someone opening their tax audit results and waited for the webpage to load while my stomach did gymnastics routines that would have impressed Olympic judges. The webpage was surprisingly professional for something that was about to either completely destroy my life or completely save it. Clean white background, official-looking logos, and a simple table of results that reduced the entire question of my biological relationship to a 4-year-old child down to cold, hard percentages. Probability of paternity, 0%. 0.00%. I was not the father. I stared at the screen for a full minute, reading and rereading those numbers like they might change if I looked at them from a different angle or squinted really hard. But they remained stubbornly, beautifully, absolutely definitive. I was not Leia's biological father. For about 30 seconds, I felt something that might have been relief if it hadn't been mixed with approximately 17 other emotions that I couldn't properly identify. Then the relief was replaced by something that felt a lot like righteous indignation mixed with the kind of anger that makes you want to do something dramatic and probably legally inadvisable. Angela had spent 4 years setting up an elaborate con game, complete with forged birth certificates and surveillance photos, to convince everyone that I was a deadbeat father who had abandoned his child. She'd had me arrested, publicly humiliated, and turned into the neighborhood pariah, all based on a lie that could have been disproven with a simple cheek swab. I forwarded the results to Carla Rodriguez, my public defender, along with a message that probably contained more profanity than was strictly professional but accurately conveyed my current emotional state. Then I printed out 3 copies of the results, because when you have evidence that proves your innocence in what amounts to an elaborate frame job, you want to make sure you have backups of your backups. 20 minutes later, I was standing on Angela's doorstep, holding those DNA results like they were a winning lottery ticket, which in a way, they kind of were. Her condo was in one of those upscale developments that screamed, "I'm successful and you're not," complete with manicured landscaping and the kind of security system that suggests the residents have things worth stealing. Angela opened the door wearing yoga pants and a tank top that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, looking like she'd just stepped out of one of those fitness magazines that make normal people feel bad about their life choices. She was holding a glass of what looked like some kind of green smoothie that probably contained more nutrients than most people consume in a week. "Tyler," she said, like she'd been expecting me, which, knowing Angela, she probably had. "You look upset. Did something happen?" I held up the DNA results, waving them in front of her face like a flag of victory. "Oh, something happened all right. Something wonderful. Something that proves you're either the world's worst liar or someone who's fundamentally confused about how biology works." She glanced at the papers with the kind of casual interest that most people reserve for junk mail or advertisements for services they don't need. "DNA results? How thorough of you. Probability of paternity, 0%, Angela. 0. I'm not the father. I'm not Leia's father. I never was Leia's father. And no amount of forged birth certificates or elaborate surveillance operations is going to change basic genetic reality." I expected her to look surprised or angry, or at least mildly concerned that her master plan had just been blown apart by the inconvenient intrusion of scientific fact. Instead, she took a sip of her green smoothie and smiled that same serene smile she'd worn when she told me she was finding herself with her personal trainer. "I know," she said simply. "You know?" I repeated, because my brain was having trouble processing this response. "You know? You mean you knew I wasn't the father this whole time?" "Of course I knew," she said, like I'd asked her something as obvious as whether water was wet or whether politicians were dishonest. "Tyler, give me some credit. I may be many things, but I'm not stupid. I know who Leia's father is." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this admission with everything that had happened over the past week. The arrest, the charges, the surveillance photos, the forged birth certificate. All of it based on a lie that she'd known was a lie from the very beginning. "Then why?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Why put me through all of this if you knew I wasn't the father?" She stepped aside and gestured for me to come in, like we were about to have a pleasant chat about the weather instead of a confrontation about her elaborate campaign to destroy my life. Her condo was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd made a career out of selling other people houses they couldn't afford. All white furniture and abstract art, and the kind of calculated perfection that suggested everything had been chosen for maximum visual impact rather than actual comfort. "Because you were perfect as the villain," she said, settling onto her white leather couch with the grace of someone who'd never had to worry about spilling anything on expensive furniture. "Think about it, Tyler. Divorced guy, living alone, no real social connections, already has a reputation as someone who couldn't maintain a marriage. Who's going to question whether someone like that might abandon a child? So this was all just what? Performance art." "This was justice," she said, and for the first time, her voice took on an edge that revealed something genuine underneath all that calculated composure. 5 years of justice for 5 years of wasted life. I sat down across from her, partly because I needed to be sitting for whatever was coming next, and partly because I was starting to feel like I was having an out-of-body experience where I was watching someone else have this conversation with my sociopathic ex-wife. "Angela," I said slowly, 5 years ago, you cheated on me. With multiple people. You destroyed our marriage, took half of everything I owned, and then disappeared from my life completely. How exactly does that translate into you being the victim here?" She leaned forward, her eyes taking on the kind of intensity that I remembered from our marriage whenever she was about to justify doing something that any reasonable person would consider completely unreasonable. "Because you made me feel small," she said. "Because every day I was married to you, I felt like I was settling for someone who was never going to be successful enough, ambitious enough, or interesting enough to deserve me. Because I wasted the best years of my life on someone who was content to be mediocre. So you decided to frame me for child abandonment. I decided to give you the life you deserved," she corrected. "A life where everyone could see exactly what kind of man Tyler Grant really is." I looked around her perfect condo, with its perfect furniture and perfect view, and suddenly understood something that probably should have been obvious from the beginning. "You're not happy," I said. "All of this success, all of this perfection, all of these elaborate revenge plots, you're still not happy. Her smile faltered for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been vulnerability if it hadn't been immediately covered up by another layer of calculated indifference. Happiness is overrated, she said. Winning is much more satisfying. And what exactly have you won here, Angela? What's your prize for proving that you can destroy someone who never did anything to you except fail to live up to your expectations? She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the view of the city that her success had bought her. I won the knowledge that I'm better than you, she said without turning around. I won the satisfaction of proving that I made the right choice when I left. And I won the peace of mind that comes from knowing that you finally understand what it feels like to lose everything. I stood up, clutching the DNA results that had somehow become both my salvation and the proof that my ex-wife was capable of levels of vindictiveness that probably qualified as performance art. Well, congratulations, Angela, I said, walking toward her front door. You've successfully proven that you're better at being terrible than I am at being mediocre. I hope that gives you all the happiness you deserve. Goodbye, Tyler, she called after me, her voice carrying that same honey-sweet tone that had fooled me for the first 3 years of our marriage. Give my regards to your criminal defense attorney. As I walked back to my car, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. Winning against Angela had never been about proving I was right or she was wrong. It had been about recognizing that some games are designed so that the only way to win is not to play at all. But unfortunately for both of us, we were already about 6 moves into a game that was far from over. I was standing in my kitchen the next morning, staring at the DNA results that I'd taped to my refrigerator like some kind of bizarre trophy, when the doorbell rang with the kind of official authority that immediately made my coffee taste like disappointment. Max, who had apparently learned nothing from our previous encounters with unexpected visitors, actually wagged his tail this time, like maybe these would be the people who finally brought treats instead of legal complications. Through the peephole, I could see 2 people in business suits that screamed, government employees with clipboards and the power to make your life significantly worse. The woman was tall, blonde, and carried herself with the kind of professional confidence that suggested she'd seen every possible variety of human dysfunction and had developed immunity to surprise. The man was shorter, younger, and looked like he was still adjusting to the weight of bureaucratic authority. I opened the door with all the enthusiasm of someone greeting the IRS for a surprise audit. Mr. Tyler Grant, the woman asked, consulting a tablet that probably contained more information about my personal life than I was comfortable with strangers having. That depends, I replied, because apparently I was incapable of learning from experience. Are you here to arrest me, serve me papers, or tell me I've won the lottery? Because honestly, at this point in my week, any of those options would be a refreshing change of pace. I'm Sarah Chun from Child Protective Services, she said, showing me an ID that looked official enough to be legitimate and terrifying enough to make me consider fleeing to Canada. This is my colleague, David Martinez. We need to speak with you about Leah Freeman. Leah Freeman, I repeated, like the name was a foreign concept that I was hearing for the first time instead of the central character in what was apparently the ongoing mini-series of my personal destruction. The 4-year-old girl I'm not related to, according to DNA evidence that I have literally taped to my refrigerator. Sarah Chun consulted her tablet with the kind of focus that suggested she was reading from a script that had been written by someone with a very creative relationship with reality. Mr. Grant, according to the paperwork filed with our office, Leah Freeman has been living in your custody for the past 6 months. Her mother, Angela Freeman, has filed documentation stating that she was no longer able to care for the child due to work commitments and that you agreed to take temporary guardianship. I blinked. Then I blinked again, just to make sure I was still in the same universe I'd woken up in that morning. I'm sorry, what now? I said, because my vocabulary had apparently been reduced to variations of confused disbelief. She filed paperwork saying the kid was living with me? That's correct, David Martinez chimed in, consulting his own tablet like he was reading from the same fantasy novel that his partner was apparently working from. We also have a sworn statement from Angela Freeman's sister, Rebecca Freeman Walsh, confirming that she witnessed you taking custody of the child and that you've been the primary caregiver since last October. I laughed, not the kind of laugh that indicates amusement, but the kind of laugh that escapes when your brain has completely given up trying to process information that defies all known laws of logic and basic human decency. Let me get this straight, I said, leaning against my doorframe because I was pretty sure my legs were about to stop working properly. Angela filed paperwork claiming that I've been taking care of a child I've never met, and her sister, who I haven't spoken to in 5 years and who probably couldn't pick me out of a lineup, confirmed this story. Mr. Grant, Sarah Chin said, and her voice took on the kind of patient tone that government employees use when they're dealing with someone they suspect might be lying, mentally unstable, or both. We understand this is a difficult situation, but we need to conduct a home inspection to ensure that Leia's living environment meets state standards for child welfare. Home inspection, I repeated, because apparently I was stuck in some kind of conversational loop where I just repeated everything these people said until it started making sense. You want to inspect my home to make sure it's suitable for a child who doesn't live here and has never lived here. That's standard procedure, David Martinez said, like we were discussing something as mundane as a routine maintenance check instead of the complete restructuring of reality as I understood it. I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in, because at this point, fighting with Child Protective Services seemed about as productive as arguing with gravity or trying to convince the IRS that taxes were optional. Please, come in, I said. Welcome to my child-free home, where the only living thing I'm responsible for is a 70-pound dog who judges my life choices and occasionally steals food off my plate. They walked through my house with the thoroughness of crime scene investigators, taking notes on everything from the fact that I didn't have child safety locks on my cabinets to the observation that my refrigerator contained beer and leftover Chinese food instead of organic juice boxes and child-friendly snacks. Mr. Grant, Sarah Chin said, stopping in front of my living room. Where does Leia sleep? She doesn't, I replied. Because she doesn't live here. Because I've never met her. Because the only children who have ever been in this house are the neighbor kids who occasionally come by to sell Girl Scout cookies. And even then, I make them stay on the porch because I'm not great with small humans. Sarah Chun made a note on her tablet that probably said something like, subject appears to be in denial about obvious child abandonment situation, or possible dissociative disorder related to parental responsibilities. Mr. Grant, she continued, we're going to need to see documentation of your income, your employment status, and any childcare arrangements you may have made for Leia. Documentation of my childcare arrangements for a child who doesn't exist in my life, I said, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of bureaucratic fever dream. Would you also like documentation of my arrangements for the unicorn I'm not keeping in my backyard and the dragon I'm not hiding in my garage? That's when my phone rang, displaying the number for Carla Rodriguez's office. I answered it with the desperate enthusiasm of someone grabbing a life preserver in the middle of a bureaucratic tsunami. Tyler. Carla's voice came through the speaker with the kind of urgency that suggested she'd been consuming her usual diet of vending machine coffee and righteous indignation. I just got word that CPS is at your house. Whatever you do, don't sign anything, don't admit to anything, and don't let them take any pictures without a warrant. Too late on the pictures, I said, watching David Martinez photograph my kitchen like he was documenting evidence at a crime scene. But I haven't signed anything yet, mostly because nobody's asked me to sign anything that would make sense in any known universe. I'm filing an emergency injunction, Carla said, and I could hear her typing in the background with the speed and intensity of someone declaring war on the entire legal system. The DNA results prove you're not the father, which means any custody arrangements are fraudulent. I'm also requesting that the court investigate Angela Freeman for filing false documents and making false statements to a government agency. What about the sister? I asked, watching Sarah Chun examine my living room like she was looking for evidence of child endangerment in my choice of throw pillows. Rebecca Freeman Walsh is going to have some very interesting conversations with investigators about perjury charges, Carla said grimly. Lying to Child Protective Services is a felony, and I'm betting she didn't think this through when she agreed to back up Angela's story. After Carla hung up, I turned to face the 2 CPS investigators who were currently treating my home like a crime scene in a case of child neglect. Here's the thing, I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the fact that I was currently starring in what felt like a mashup between a legal thriller and a psychological horror movie. I understand you're just doing your jobs, and I respect that. But I need you to understand that everything you've been told about me and my relationship to Leah Freeman is a complete fabrication created by my vindictive ex-wife, who has apparently decided that destroying my life is a more interesting hobby than taking up knitting or learning to play the piano. Sarah Chun looked up from her tablet with the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard variations of this story before, probably from people who actually were guilty of the things they were being accused of. Mr. Grant, she said, we have to investigate every report we receive, regardless of the circumstances. If you're innocent of these charges, the investigation will prove that. And in the meantime? I asked. In the meantime, she replied, we'll be monitoring the situation closely. We'll need you to remain available for follow-up interviews, and we'll be checking in regularly until this matter is resolved. After they left, I found myself standing in my living room, staring at the business card Sarah Chun had given me, which listed a phone number I could call if I had questions or concerns about child welfare issues. I walked out to get my mail, and that's when I found it. Another envelope, wedged under my doormat like some kind of sinister welcome mat surprise. This one was smaller than the surveillance photos, but somehow felt heavier with implications. I opened it standing right there on my front porch, because at this point, privacy felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in the same block letters as before. You don't have to be the father to pay like one. A friend. I looked up and down my street, half expecting to see Angela or one of her accomplices watching from behind a tree or crouched behind a car, but the neighborhood looked exactly as peaceful and normal as it had before my life became a daytime soap opera written by someone with a vindictive imagination and access to government forms. That night, I double-checked all my locks, not because I was afraid of burglars, but because I was starting to realize that Angela's idea of winning this game might involve escalation beyond just bureaucratic harassment. And frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what her next move was going to be. Greg was in the middle of what looked like a personal training session with a woman who clearly took her fitness much more seriously than I took mine. But he spotted me through the floor-to-ceiling windows and waved me over with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation. Tyler, he said, finishing up with his client and walking over with a towel draped around his neck like some kind of athletic fashion accessory. I was wondering when you'd come back. I heard about the DNA results. Congratulations on not being a father, I guess? Thanks, I said, though I have to admit, it's not the kind of congratulations I ever expected to receive. Listen, Greg, I need to ask you some more questions about Angela. Specifically, I need to know if you're aware of any other guys she might have pulled this same scam on. His expression shifted from casual gym bro friendliness to something more serious, like he was accessing memories that he'd preferred to keep filed under mistakes I'd rather not think about. Actually, he said, glancing around the gym to make sure we weren't being overheard, there might be someone you should talk to. Guy named Marcus Chun. He's a financial advisor, works downtown. Angela dated him around the same time she was seeing me, and from what I heard through mutual friends, she pulled some kind of similar stunt with him. Similar how? Fake pregnancy scare, followed by demands for emotional support and financial assistance. I don't know all the details, but I heard he ended up paying for what he thought were medical expenses related to a miscarriage that probably never happened. This was getting better and better. Not only was Angela a serial cheater, but she was apparently a serial scammer who had turned fake pregnancies into some kind of twisted business model. Do you have his contact information? Greg pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly thought this day might come eventually. Here, he said, showing me the screen. Marcus Chun, Chun Financial Planning. Tell him Greg from the gym sent you, and that it's about Angela Freeman. He'll know what you're talking about. An hour later, I was sitting in the waiting room of Chun Financial Planning, which was located in one of those downtown office buildings that screamed, successful people work here and you probably can't afford their services. The waiting room had the kind of expensive furniture and strategic art placement that suggested Marcus Chun was either very good at his job or very good at convincing people he was good at his job. Marcus turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from someone whose business involved managing other people's money. Impeccably dressed, professionally friendly, and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that comes from understanding compound interest and tax shelters. But when I mentioned Angela's name, His professional demeanor cracked just enough to reveal something that looked a lot like old anger mixed with newer wisdom. "Angela Freeman," he said, settling behind his desk like he was preparing for a business meeting that might require legal disclaimers. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Greg said you wanted to talk about her." "She's my ex-wife," I explained, "and she's currently trying to destroy my life using what appears to be a playbook she's used before. I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand her methods." Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring out his office window at the city beyond like he was accessing files that he'd hoped never to open again. "She told me she was pregnant," he said finally, "about 6 months after we started seeing each other. Said it was mine, said she was scared and didn't know what to do. I was 32, making good money, thought I was ready to be responsible for someone else. So I stepped up. What happened? I paid for doctor's visits, prenatal vitamins, maternity clothes. Gave her money for what she said were medical expenses related to complications. Probably dropped about $8,000 over 4 months, thinking I was being a supportive partner and future father. And then she said she lost the baby. Miscarriage at about 20 weeks. I felt terrible, obviously. Guilty that I'd been relieved when she first told me she was pregnant. Devastated that we'd lost what I'd started thinking of as our child. I supported her through what I thought was her grief, paid for counseling sessions, even took time off work to be there for her. This was sounding depressingly familiar. Angela had apparently perfected the art of emotional manipulation to the point where it could be studied as a master class in psychological warfare. "When did you find out it was fake?" "About 2 months after the supposed miscarriage, I ran into her at a restaurant. She was with another guy, looking happy and healthy and definitely not like someone who was grieving the loss of a pregnancy. When she saw me, she looked like she'd been caught shoplifting by her elementary school principal. What did you do?" I confronted her, obviously. Asked her what the hell was going on, why she was out having romantic dinners when she was supposed to be dealing with the trauma of losing our child. That's when she admitted that she'd never been pregnant in the first place. I leaned forward in my chair, because this was exactly the kind of information that might actually help Carla build a case that would expose Angela's pattern of fraud and manipulation. "She admitted it was all fake?" "She said it had been a miscommunication," Marcus said, making air quotes with the kind of precision that suggested he'd replayed this conversation in his head many times over the years. "Said she'd thought she was pregnant, but it turned out to be a false alarm, and she'd been too embarrassed to tell me the truth." "But you didn't buy it?" "Tyler, I'm a financial advisor. My job is to spot inconsistencies and figure out when people are trying to scam the system. Angela's story had more holes than a government budget proposal. The timeline didn't work. The medical expenses she'd claimed were way too high for routine prenatal care, and she'd never actually shown me any documentation from doctors or insurance companies." "Did you report her to anyone?" "I thought about it, but what was I going to report? That my girlfriend had lied about being pregnant? That's not exactly a crime. It's just a really expensive lesson about trusting people who turn out to be sociopaths." But Marcus had something that made him different from just another victim of Angela's emotional warfare. He had documentation. Receipts, bank transfers, text messages, even recordings of some of their conversations that he'd made when he'd started getting suspicious about her story. "I keep records of everything," he explained, opening a file cabinet that looked like it contained more organizational systems than the Library of Congress. "Occupational hazard of working in finance. When Angela started asking for money, I documented every transaction, every conversation, every request." He pulled out a folder that was thick enough to be a small novel, filled with printouts of text messages, bank transfer receipts, and what looked like transcripts of recorded phone calls. "She was thorough, I'll give her that," he said, flipping through the documentation. "She had fake symptoms, fake doctor's appointments, even fake pregnancy test results that she'd somehow managed to doctor to look positive. If I hadn't gotten suspicious and started investigating, I probably would have believed the whole thing." "What made you start investigating?" "She asked for money to pay for a procedure that I knew wasn't covered by the insurance she claimed to have. When I offered to call the doctor's office directly to arrange payment, she got angry and accused me of not trusting her. That's when I realized that someone who's telling the truth doesn't usually get defensive about verification. This was exactly what I needed. Not just another victim of Angela's cons, but a victim who'd been smart enough to document everything and professional enough to build a case that would hold up under legal scrutiny." Marcus made copies of everything relevant to Angela's scam, and by the time I left his office, I had a folder that was thick enough to use as a weapon and detailed enough to serve as a blueprint for prosecutorial vindication. But the real breakthrough came when Marcus mentioned something that made my blood run cold and my coffee taste like victory at the same time. "There's something else," he said as I was getting ready to leave. "Angela's sister, Rebecca. She was part of the scam. Rebecca Freeman Walsh. The one who gave a statement to Child Protective Services. That's the one. She was the one who called me pretending to be a nurse from Angela's doctor's office, giving me updates about the pregnancy and asking me to verify my insurance information for billing purposes. I recorded that call too, because I was already getting suspicious at that point." "You recorded Angela's sister impersonating a medical professional." "I recorded Angela's sister committing fraud by impersonating a medical professional to obtain personal financial information under false pretenses," Marcus corrected. "That's not just lying to help your siblings' love life. That's a felony that could result in federal charges." I left Marcus's office feeling like I'd just been handed the keys to Angela's downfall, wrapped up in a bow made of legally admissible evidence and tied together with federal crime charges. Carla Rodriguez was going to love this. The district attorney's office was going to love this even more. And Angela? Angela was about to discover that some games have consequences that extend far beyond the original players. Because if there's one thing I'd learned from this whole experience, it was that documentation beats manipulation every single time. And now I had enough documentation to bury Angela's entire operation so deep that she'd need archaeological equipment to find her way back to the surface. The courtroom was packed when Angela's sentencing hearing finally arrived. Fraud, perjury, filing false reports, identity theft. The list of charges read like a crime spree planned by someone with a law degree and a serious grudge. Angela lost custody of Leia immediately, the little girl going into foster care, while the system figured out what to do next. I'll never forget the first time I met Leia during a supervised visit at the social services building. She was this tiny kid with curls that wouldn't quit and eyes that looked way too serious for a 4-year-old. The caseworker explained who I was, and Leia just stared at me for about 30 seconds before running over and shouting, "Hi, Daddy." My heart completely shattered. Here's this kid who doesn't know me from Adam, but she's been told I'm her father, and she's just rolling with it like kids do. She wrapped her little arms around my legs and looked up at me like I was supposed to have all the answers. "Are you really my daddy?" she asked. "Well," I said, crouching down to her level, "that's complicated. But I'm definitely someone who's going to make sure you're okay." 3 months later, Carla asked if I'd consider guardianship. Think about it, Tyler. She knows you as her father. The foster system is overloaded. You've got a stable home, steady income, and you're already emotionally invested. Carla, I just learned how to keep a houseplant alive for more than 2 weeks. You want me raising an actual human being. But deep down, I already knew my answer. This little girl had been used as a pawn in Angela's revenge game, and she deserved better than that. She deserved someone who'd put her first. The adoption hearing was surprisingly simple. Judge Martinez reviewed the case, looked at all the documentation about Angela's fraud, and basically said, "This kid needs a stable home, and you're the closest thing she has to family. Are you sure about this?" "Your Honor," I said, "I'm not sure about anything anymore. But I'm sure about her." When the gavel came down, Leia was officially mine. Not biologically, but legally, emotionally, completely. She tugged on my sleeve as we left the courthouse. "Can we get pancakes now, Daddy?" I laughed, and for the first time in months, it wasn't the bitter laugh of someone whose life had imploded. It was the laugh of someone who just realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst situations. "Sweetheart," I said, picking her up, "after everything we've been through, you're getting the entire IHOP menu." Angela had tried to destroy me by giving me a fake daughter. Instead, she'd given me a real family. Revenge is sweet, but pancakes with Leia on Saturday mornings? That's sweeter than anything Angela could ever understand.